Good evening. Welcome to People for Effective Government online event. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Jenny Darrell. PEG is a nonprofit, Spokane-based, nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've been holding in-person forums and online events for over 2 years. For those who are new to our organization and events, we look forward to having you with us in the future. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. We're working to encourage sincere and civil debate about the challenges that our nation faces and about effective solutions to those challenges. If you're finding these events helpful as you think about issues in government at the local, state, and federal level, please consider joining as a member or making a donation to PEG. We are a nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our small costs. If you're interested in learning more about PEG and possibly becoming a member, please visit our website at www.pegnow.org. This event is being videotaped and will be posted on our website in a week or two. As always, the views presented by our guest speakers are their own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind. Our audience is encouraged to submit questions for our speaker via the Zoom Q&A feature. Please keep them brief so we can get to as many questions as time allows. PEG board member Mark Kinney will co-moderate the Q&A portion of the evening. It is a great honor to introduce our speaker this evening. President Obama once said of our guest, he's an example of the very best that this nation has to offer, and we owe him a great debt of gratitude. Retired career ambassador Ryan Crocker was PEG's guest speaker in September 2019. He spoke about the turbulent history in the Middle East, particularly about events following the Arab Spring and up until the fall of 2019. Much has happened in the Middle East in this last year. Ambassador Crocker is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has taught at Princeton University, Yale University, the University of Virginia, Texas A&M University, I went there, where he was Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service. In August 2013, he was confirmed by the United States Senate to serve on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees all U.S. government-supported civilian international media. He served as a board member until June of this year. He retired from the Foreign Service in April 2009 after a career of over 37 years, but was recalled to active duty by President Obama to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan in 2011. He served as U.S. Ambassador 6 times over 14 years in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. Born in Spokane, Washington, he grew up in an Air Force family, attending schools in Morocco, Canada, and Turkey, as well as in the US. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English in 1971 and an honorary Doctor of Laws degree in 2001 from Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Academy of Diplomacy, and the Association of American Ambassadors. He's also on the board of directors of Mercy Corps International and is a trustee for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Ambassador Crocker received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award, in 2009. In July 2012, he was named an honorary Marine, the 75th civilian so honored since the founding of the Corps in 1775. Just last week, he was awarded the Thayer Award at a ceremony at West Point. This is an annual honor given to the American citizen who embodies the military academy's motto of duty, honor, country. Previous recipients include former Presidents Dwight Eisenhower and George W. Bush, Colin Powell, Neil Armstrong, and Walter Cronkite. PEG members are honored and grateful to have him as a return speaker. Welcome to the Honorable Ryan C. Crocker, retired Career Ambassador, U.S. Foreign Service. Take it away, Ambassador Crocker.
Well, thanks very much, Jenny, for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be back with you. I remember with great fondness my first encounter. And let me just underscore again how important I see these efforts and the role of groups like PEG. As I watch the turmoil sweeping through this country, the political turmoil, often it has seemed to me that I've seen and heard some of these things before, that this isn't exactly new to me. And it took me a while to figure it out. Some of the things I'm seeing and hearing were reminiscent of things I saw and heard in places like Baghdad, Kabul, Beirut, where political factionalism rises to the point where any kind of compromise or joint effort just becomes impossible. Coming out of the authoritarian societies that ruled in those countries, you can understand why, that a compromise is a concession is a defeat, and defeat is death. We don't have that excuse in this country. And whatever this election brings, I very, very much hope that it will bring the voices of Americans everywhere saying, time out. Let's rebase, rethink, and find a way to move forward together. That's always been the strength of our great nation. And after my visit to West Point, I'm encouraged to think that it remains the strength of our great nation. And the role of PEG in these endeavors, I think, is of an importance that cannot be stressed too often or too strongly. So the Middle East, source of infinite variation and fascination. We've had 4 years now of President Trump as our president. A lot has happened in the Middle East. So is it chaos, or is it moving in a more calculated direction? Well, since it's in the Middle East, I would say both. So let me just underscore, if I might, some of the major developments we've seen in that region since the president took office. It was noteworthy to me that his very first trip overseas as president of the United States was to the Middle East. It was the first country he visited was Saudi Arabia. He went on from there to Israel. What might have motivated his thinking? Why would he do that? Well, when you look at his overall approach to the legacy he had from President Obama, I think it's fair to say he has spent an awful lot of time trying to erase it. In the Middle East, by the time President Obama left office, our relations with major Middle Eastern states were at a very low ebb. really with all of our traditional allies, with Israel, certainly. We had the spectacle of Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to Washington to address a session of Congress to lobby against the Iran nuclear deal that had been negotiated under President Obama's auspices. A fairly unique act, thank goodness. The King of Jordan, a traditional ally of the United States, said publicly toward the end of the Obama administration that he had come to think that he had more belief in the goodness and efficacy of American power in the Middle East than the Americans did. President Sisi of Egypt said to me a few years back at the General Assembly in New York that forever grateful for the Egypt-Israeli peace that could not have been reached without the Americans. He nonetheless regretted that he at that point had a better relationship with the Israeli prime minister than he did with the American president. And on it goes. And I point this out to say that I do believe that was a motivating factor in President Trump's choice of where he would go first in the region. Now, something small but significant happened in that visit to Saudi Arabia. Because after Saudi Arabia, the president went to Israel. And for decades now, the procedure of flying from one country to another was a little bit complicated in the sense that because the Saudis did not extend diplomatic recognition to Israel, they would not permit Air Force One to file a flight plan direct from Riyadh to Tel Aviv. They had to file to a third country, and then once clear of Saudi airspace, they would refile in the air for Israel. On this visit, for the first time, the Saudis said, file direct. And also just fine with us if you want to publicize that. So again, a small but significant signal that Saudi Arabia was prepared to take a very quiet set of connections to Israel. Saudi Arabia was prepared to have some light shone on those connections. And for people in my former line of work, these little things, you watch them carefully because a small gesture like this can lead to a major move on down the road. The Saudis took advantage of that first visit and the clear signals of support that they received from President Trump to do something that I don't think the Trump administration expected. They almost immediately announced a complete blockade of the state of Qatar, a small peninsula in the Middle East, which had been a thorn in the side of the Saudis for years, mainly through their Al Jazeera television channel. I think that caught the administration off guard, but the Qataris, in a sense, were ready for it. We have a huge Air Force base in Qatar that is vital for our operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now in Syria. I negotiated that agreement some years ago as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. The strategy we took in negotiating the agreement was I got together with Department of Defense officials and with Central Command officials that we would just ask for the world, everything we could possibly think of. Like the Qataris would pay for everything, they would have no access to the base, that we would not tell them before, during, or after operations we might have launched from the base, and on it went. We figured we put all that to them, they'd chop back 20% and we would still have a really good deal. Foreign Minister of Qatar came to Washington. The draft agreement, like 200 pages of it, was delivered to him at his embassy. The next morning, he came in with his staff to the negotiating table, dropped the pile of papers on the table and said his staff had been through it. He only had one question, and that question was, is this all we're asking, or is there something else? And we, on the American side, all looked at each other and said, you know, what idiots we are. We should have asked him to pay the operating costs of every Army base in the country. The reason they were so ready to sign that agreement was their get out of jail free card. That as long as we were at that base, as long as it was absolutely essential for our military movements in the region, they had a defensive shield, mainly against the Saudis. And when the Saudis announced that blockade, they flipped that card on the table. And while the blockade may have caused some inconvenience, it certainly didn't cause them any real pain. And again, and from their perspective, it was the guarantee that the Saudis would not literally march into the country. I belabor all of this just to give you an example of the complexities that run through our Middle East operations and the moves within moves within moves that we may or may not be aware of when we take certain positions. What else happened? Well, President Trump moved the United States Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Now, every presidential candidate in modern times has pledged to do that. And every president, after being elected, has not done that. Out of concern that it would be a step so dramatic, Jerusalem, of course, being the holy city for the three great revealed religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that by recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital through something as dramatic as moving our embassy there would just torpedo our relations with the Arabs, and with it too the Arab-Israeli peace process. Not exactly. There were no such reactions, not from the other Arab states, and not from the Palestinians. Does that mean that all is well and will continue to be well? Not exactly. It had been a point of particular significance for Arabs over the years. We're going to have to wait and see on that one. What it did not do was deter Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, along with Qatar, three of the smaller kingdoms on the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, did not deter them from, in August, of concluding formal peace with Israel. Major event at the White House, hands were shaken, pledges were made to a new era in Israeli-Arab peace. Not only was it was done relatively quickly and for the Middle East very quietly. There were a lot of signals that this was about to happen. Now, a lot of the critics of the president downplayed the significance of these events, these formal peace treaties, saying it was simply consecrating what was already known, that the Gulf states have had connections and informal relationships with the Israelis for years, which of course is all true, but I don't think it can be dismissed that easily. To have de facto understandings and quiet dealings, while important, is not the same as that public handshake and the opening of embassies on both sides. That is a major development, and there's really no way you can discount it by saying they were already there. They weren't already there. Formal recognition, the establishment of embassies in diplomatic life are crucial steps. And in so doing, it doubled the number of countries, Arab countries, that formally recognize the state of Israel. Up to that point, Egypt and Jordan, and now Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. So it was an event of significance. It's also important to kind of take a look at what might have motivated those two countries and what it might tell us about the position of Saudi Arabia. It's a little difficult for me to read the United Arab Emirates on this. Their relationship with Saudi Arabia has become strained. They were all in with the Saudis when the Saudis launched an air war into Yemen, and indeed put a number of their special forces personnel on the ground, which in Yemen, which Saudi did not. As time went by, losses mounted, progress was little to none. The UAE became clearly disenchanted with the Saudis. They pulled out their troop contingents and have been critical of the Saudi approach. So it does not seem to me at face value that the UAE recognition of Israel was in any way a signal of Saudi approval. It's different with Bahrain. The small island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf is of significance to us. We have had a naval headquarters there since the 1940s. It's the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet. So what happens in Bahrain is important to us. What happens in Bahrain is, of course, also very important to the Saudis. Here's why. You have a minority Sunni Islam ruling family, ruling a majority of Shia Islam people. We all see the headlines. We all know that, gee, Sunnis and Shia don't seem to be getting on too well. The Bahraini government had long alleged that Iran was directly interfering in Bahrain, certainly not a silly conjecture, to say the least. And that government in Bahrain looked to Saudi Arabia for critical support to ensure their survival. And Saudi Arabia indeed has intervened in the past, has sent troops to help maintain stability and to quell violent demonstrations. So the UAE and its motivations vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, a little bit murky for me. Now with Bahrain, there is no way I can conceive that Bahrain would have signed that agreement without tacit Saudi approval. Does that mean the Saudis are going to be the next in line? I don't really know, but I do think these agreements are more significant than many of the president's critics have been willing to say. Iran. President Trump made it clear during the campaign that he thought the nuclear agreement between Iran, the members of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in Germany, was the worst deal ever, and that he would rescind it. It took him a while, but that's exactly what he did. We then saw several other steps. In January of this year, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, then the commander of the Quds force, Quds, by the way, being Jerusalem in both Arabic and Farsi, a longtime nemesis for the United States, effectively responsible for Iran's overseas operations. Some of those operations, of course, have been against us, including the use of Iranian-made munitions by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq when I was ambassador there. that took the lives of a number of our troopers. My first reaction, hearing that Soleimani had been killed, was good. A really, really bad actor had been taken off the table. My second reaction was, now what? And this takes us back to the theme: is this chaos or calculation? Again, with the Soleimani killing, I think a little of both. It was definitely a bold step, but I certainly didn't get the impression that the president had thought through the now what. And I would have to tell you right now, it's been something like 8 or 9 months since that act took place. Nothing much is happening out there. So maybe we're done with this. We're not done with it. We have been in a undeclared conflict with Iran literally since the 1979 revolution. It has ebbed and flowed. It has found different theaters. Lebanon, for example, where we paid some pretty heavy prices when I was there. More recently in Syria, certainly in Iraq. So with all that is going on, I hope the administration is not losing track of how Iran might be positioning itself, what it might do as time moves on. There's going to be another round, and a round after that, and a round after that. I mean, this has been going on for almost 40 years, and it is still very much in play. Which leads to another Iran-related point. The administration, in pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, said that it would do everything it could to pressure the Iranian government into making some major concessions that would be tantamount, basically, to overturning their own Islamic revolution. And the administration has found occasion to just consistently tighten the economic chokehold over Iran. Our partners in the Iranian nuclear deal have protested that, but no one has bucked us because no one in Europe, certainly, is prepared to incur the wrath of the United States by violating our sanctions. They know that our retaliation would be far more costly to them than any benefit they would achieve by doing business with Iran. So the economic pressure on Iran continues to mount. What will be the consequence? Will the Iranians become kinder and gentler? I don't know. I wouldn't bet on that one. What will they do if they reach the point of economic collapse and beyond? And in terms, again, of the agreements that we've seen, it's worth bearing in mind as one looks at United Arab Emirates and Iran, that there is a history there too. At the time of independence of the British-controlled Arab Persian Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates, in that year of change, 1970, 1971, the Iranian Navy moved to seize 3 small islands that were part of the United Arab Emirates. Again, these were not the Ayatollahs who did it under the Islamic Republic. It was our steadfast ally, the Shah of Iran, who did it. So those islands continue to be occupied, and clearly that was a factor in UAE thinking. And I mentioned this. These are small countries far away. We have little information on them or their history. And as we move into complex dealings, we sometimes pay for that. Syria, a lot of tumult there. Should we stay or should we go after the last overt elements of the Islamic State were eradicated? or should we stay to try to control the immediate post-conflict period and maybe bring some further pressure on the Syrian regime, very tightly allied with Iran, against the Islamic State. Tremendous amount of flap and froth, criticisms, confusing signals. It has settled down for the moment, at least. We have a minimal presence in Syria, about which you hear very little, which is probably exactly what the administration wants. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute if I don't completely forget to. Farther afield, Afghanistan, not a part of the greater Middle East, except by my definition, and it's there by my definition because I served there. It is very clear that we are going home. We've been in direct talks with the Taliban for the better part of a year now. A concession we made that we had refused to make before because it delegitimizes the Afghan government. We have an agreement of sorts with the Taliban. There has been a non-substantive meeting in which the Afghan government was present, but not much has happened. And for the Taliban, not much needs to happen. They read us, and I think they read us very correctly. We're going home. President Trump is going to zero us out in Afghanistan. And many would say that's a good thing. You know, we've been there almost 20 years. I don't think it's such a good thing, and I'll tell you why. On the strategic level, the national security level, the Taliban has pledged that they will sunder all ties with Al-Qaeda and other Arab militant groups. You know, look, you could not convince a 3-year-old that that's the case. The Taliban has endured 20 years in the wilderness precisely because they would not give up Al-Qaeda. We gave them that chance in 2001. Hand over the Al-Qaeda leadership and we will not invade. They chose the invasion and they chose exile rather than betray their allies. They will say whatever we want them to say because they know we're going and they know that when we go, we're not going to be coming back. So I think this decision to leave Afghanistan from a national security standpoint is quite reckless. Something else that troubles me deeply, I reopened our embassy in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. And I remember my first congressional visitor in January of 2002. It was then Senator Joe Biden, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He came out and spent a couple of days with us. And one of the things I did was take him to visit an Afghan girls' school. Afghan girls had no education after the Taliban took power. They all girls' schools were closed down. They never saw the inside of a classroom. And that school to which I took the chairman, first grade class, and there were 6-year-old girls, first graders. There were also 12-year-old girls, first graders, who had lost their chance of education 6 years before. And I asked one of the older girls if it had bothered her to be in class with kids literally half her age. She just smiled at me and said she didn't care who else was there, she was there. We encouraged Afghan women to step forward, get involved in politics, run for parliament, open businesses, teach at universities, join the military. It was, you step forward, we got your back. And it was one of those shining moments when our interests and our values actually coincided. It was wonderful to see. But now what we're saying to these Afghan women and girls is, Yeah, well, that was then, and my goodness, look at the time. We've really got to be going. So, goodbye and good luck. Who knows? Maybe they won't kill most of you. It is an act of cynical indifference that this administration has embarked on to really put Afghan females in the position to get it in the neck when the Taliban retake the country. And it bothers me too, there's almost no discussion of that here in the United States. And I guess that would be the point to which I would return. It was a point I made last year and feel it just as strongly now. The role of a global free press and how important that is. Something we often take for granted, but what we have seen in the span of my long career overseas, we have seen the number of foreign correspondents, international journalists, shrink and shrink and shrink. When I was in Beirut at the time of the Israeli invasion in the early 1980s, everybody had a Beirut bureau. I mean, the TV, all the print newspapers, even regional papers had Beirut bureaus, and they had Cairo bureaus and Tel Aviv bureaus. Americans had a window on the world. Well, the world is a whole lot more complex than it was back then, and we have far fewer correspondents to bring us the news. And here again, in a democracy, I think you kind of get the news coverage that you want, and we seem to be far more interested in entertainment than we are in hard news. The shouting matches that all of the major news stations seem to revel in now, be it MSNBC, Fox, or CNN. It's about entertainment. It's not about hard news. And a lot is happening in the world that we are just not seeing. And I also think, too, of the state of the media in our own country. Kind of the same thing is going on. Let's all crash on the same story at once. We all know what the storylines are. It depends on your political affiliation. We are in a period where I think we are facing absolutely momentous choices, and we are increasingly unequipped and unprepared because of a lack of a consistent, in-depth media probe on all of these things that frankly just really, really worries me. So on that happy note, I would now turn it back to you and some questions, I hope. And if we don't have sufficient questions, I could go on for another half hour on the history of agriculture in Mesopotamia. So be sure you got some teed up or you'll really regret it. Thanks.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions. Mark, do you want to start?
Sure, I had one that I thought of while you were making your remarks about Syria. President Trump tends to emphasize the fact that we remain in Syria, and he always brings up Syrian oil fields, the fact that we're there protecting the oil. Why are we really there?
Well, if he thinks we're there to protect the oil, we're in deep trouble. Syria does have oil. There is not much of it. It is extremely low quality, very high on sulfur. At one point, when I was ambassador to Syria, we were actually lifting Syrian oil, small amounts. There was only one refinery in the United States that would process it. This refinery in New Jersey was equipped so that it basically could distill tennis shoes and produce something. But again, the same charge was made about Iraq, which has serious oil of seriously good quality. It was not true then, and it's not true now in Syria. I think what senior military commanders would say is that we made an agreement with the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds. They became our ally in the fight to eradicate Islamic State. And they lost a lot of people doing it, and that we have a moral obligation to see that they are not now rolled over and made to pay for their support for our initiatives. More broadly, there is a view, I think, possibly in the administration, possibly elsewhere, that it's a very confused situation where you have armies from a variety of different countries now in close contact. The Turkish ground forces are inside Syria. Russia has ground forces inside Syria. There have been clashes up in the northwest, where Islamic militants are still holding out. We have Israel engaged from the air, not on the ground, but from the air. And we have Iran with both conventional and non-conventional forces. So you've got three significant regional powers, and then of course Russia, all maneuvering around inside of Syria, and that it behooves us to keep a small force there to be able to monitor and, if necessary, react to situations that could be sharply against our interests. And again, I don't know if it was deliberate or it just happened that way. I think the president threw up so many different statements on what he was going to do, pulling out all our forces, so forth and so on, that most folks are not quite sure what the end state has been. All I can say is we are present with quite a small force there. It has nothing to do with the oil. And indeed, they're deployed, I think, north of where the major oil fields are. I traveled in that area extensively when I was ambassador. So it's the way it is settled out. I think it is what I would have tried to get to had I been responsible for making recommendations or decisions. Keep a small force, be sure they are not overly vulnerable to attacks from some of our adversaries, and let's see what happens next. But let's keep our hand in the game again with a minimal force, and have that as the possible basis for different options as they may arise.
Thank you.
I have one from the audience. Could you please comment on the Israeli-Palestinian agreement that Jared Kushner negotiated and announced earlier this year?
Well, thanks very much for that question. I was going to include it in my introductory remarks, which had gotten overly long anyway. So two things. We had that long-awaited rollout of the Kushner plan, if you will, which from a Palestinian perspective was everything they feared, that it effectively would deprive them of any meaningful sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem. It would rob them of contiguous land segments, chopping them up into Palestinian Bantustans, to borrow a word from South Africa under the days of apartheid. It would leave them totally beholden on Israel for almost everything, the movement of people, the movement of goods. It was guaranteed to be stillborn from the, in terms of its efficacy with the Palestinians. Nothing in there they felt that would give them the slightest ray of hope that by signing on to it, they could get to a better place than they are right now. Sadly, the Palestinian leadership did what I am reasonably confident that the Israeli government hoped they would do, and perhaps our government as well, which was to reject the whole thing just no, 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 offering no alternatives, nor seeking another avenue of approach. That, for example, they could have reached out to France. President Macron has shown himself to be very interested in trying to exercise French influence in parts of the Middle East where France traditionally has had a role to play, like Lebanon, which he has visited. Under Mahmoud Abbas, the octogenarian president of the Palestinian Authority, there was no such effort. Just sit there and say no. And this tendency has caused the Palestinians a lot over the years, going all the way back to the 67 war. But there's another element here. To go back to those agreements that I mentioned with the UAE and Bahrain, for the Palestinians, this is not good news. They are becoming irrelevant. No longer are countries prepared to maintain a technical state of war with Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. To use non-recognition as political pressure to get Israel committed to a genuine peace process and a two-state solution, which has, of course, been on the books as an Arab position since 2002. So it's kind of a double whammy, if you will, that with this long-awaited U.S. peace plan, it is clear to the Palestinians we're not going to be leading an impartial negotiation anytime soon on the basis of that document, to say the least, but also that the Arab states are no longer even paying lip service to the Palestinian cause. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Under different leadership in the Palestinian territories, maybe some room for some creative thinking here, because the Palestinians, while ostensibly the object of Arab solicitude from outside, really have been used by the Arabs, often by the other Arabs, often to justify repressive measures against their own people. So, you're an authoritarian Arab ruler, and you want to justify that authoritarianism. Well, there's the Palestinian cause. Let's invoke that and a state of war with Israel, technically, and let's have an emergency law to silence dissent at home. Because how could any traitorous voices be allowed to be heard when we are in this state of war? Egypt, after its peace treaty with Israel, 1979, had an emergency law on the books for about 2 more decades. So there's been a very crass misuse of the Palestinian cause by other Arab states. And I think a creative, imaginative, and bold Palestinian leadership might be able to get some running room there to make some deals that couldn't have been made before. Unfortunately, the current Palestinian Authority is neither creative nor bold. So we're going to have to see what happens when, as time marches on and eventually a new leadership arises. We're not going to get anywhere with the current leaders in the Palestinian Authority.
Mark, do you want one?
I do. I have one, and kind of a two-parter. Your first response may be a little bit quick, but so the formal recognition of Bahrain and UAE of Israel, you talked about that a little bit previously. How much of that do you think was motivated by wanting to increase commerce, simplify commerce with Israel?
I think that is a factor. That Israel has, of course, put a lot of effort and investment into the high-tech sectors. They have some very, very good products out there on the market I think you're right in the way you phrase it. Those products are already finding a way onto shelves in Arab markets. The boycott of Israel, long a staple of Arab foreign policy, barely exists even in name these days. There's no effort to enforce it. But it has required, more indirect ways of moving stuff, a lot of complications and payments and so forth. So this isn't going to open the floodgates, but it is going to facilitate that type of trade. And it's going to be interesting to see how that might extend to the energy sector, because again, Bahrain, like Syria, a very minimal producer at this point, nothing of really even regional significance. Egypt and Jordan, of course, the other two countries at formal peace with Israel, no oil, but the UAE, of course, is awash in it. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on that level. I mean, for the first time, Israel now has formal peace with a major oil exporter, and where that might lead them.
Jenny, can I just have a follow-up?
Sure.
So, Ambassador, you talked about how a state of conflict has existed with Iran all the way back to the 70s, late 70s. Of course, we did take out Soleimani in Iraq, on Iraqi territory. And so there was some Iranian response to that. They did a rocket attack, right? I think on one of our bases, intentionally missed, we think, so as not to provoke another response. But recently, the Green Zone has been under attack with a lot of rocket fire, almost on a daily basis. Do you think that has something to do with the Iranians? And of course, we have threatened to pull out of Iraq as a result of this if Iraq doesn't get that under control.
Yeah, it's a great question. Going back again to the January killing of Soleimani and the aftermath, if you recall, President Trump had made a big deal of the fact that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, did not put any limits on Iran's development of ballistic missiles. Well, those were ballistic missiles that were used against us. And so not only were there no restrictions, now they were shooting them at us. Something that kind of got overlooked in the whole process. Hard to say that it's a step forward when the agreement you walked away from, because it didn't cover ballistic missiles, is then followed by a period in which your initiatives, if you will, result in those missiles being used against you. Certainly those missiles are more accurate than some of the munitions the Iranians were throwing at us when I was ambassador there in Baghdad. But the notion of pinpoint precision from a missile, not really pinpoint. Pinpoint is what you get from a drone. The killing of Soleimani, that was pinpoint, but that you got to have the drone right over your target to get that degree of accuracy. Not the case with these missile strikes. So frankly, I think it was a situation of the Iranians firing them off, saying, boy, I hope they don't kill any Americans. While we hunkered down and said, boy, I hope they don't kill any of us. And that is what transpired. You could, when the president made the announcement afterwards, you could see his sense of relief that no one had been killed, and that would have forced his hand to retaliate again. So it's still again to be continued. Now, in terms of what's happening in Baghdad, yeah, we're threatening the Iraqis with closing our embassy because, I don't know, a Katyusha or some other completely inaccurate munition landed a mile away. Well, they were bouncing those things off our heads for The 2 years I was in Baghdad was kind of business as usual. I say that because I think it's in looking for a pretext. Get our troops out, and now let's close the embassy, and it's somebody else's problem. And I find this kind of stunning because that was sort of what the Obama administration did. After 2010, 2011, we pulled all our forces out. What did we get? 3 years later, we got Islamic State controlling a third of Iraq. That forced us to send troops back in. Well, the environment hasn't changed all that much. And again, it's not ancient history. Why the president thinks that, hey, close down everything and we can just put an X through it and we'll never have to worry about it again. It is also inconsistent, quite frankly, with his overall Iran policy. He says we're going to press Iran from every angle we can, except let's just run for cover in Iraq. And I worry about that too, because kind of the backdrop to our whole conversation here is how the Trump administration views America's role in the world. And we're seeing a kind of neo-isolationism, if you will. President Trump has pulled us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, making a day in China. That partnership was designed to bring us in with other Asian states, with China not in, to have a regional common front to deal with Chinese economic pressures and their military expansionism into the Pacific. He pulled us out of that. He pulled us out of the Iran nuclear deal, and he pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords. I'm not here to debate the merits of any of those, but simply to say it is a clear process of retrenchment, that the American era is over, that the American era that began at the end of World War II, where we designed the elements of a post-conflict new international order, the United Nations in San Francisco, the Bretton Woods agreements that put the world on the dollar standard, New Hampshire, NATO. We are now in the post-Pax Americana era, if you will. And again, to be fair, it didn't start with Trump. It started under President Obama. The Obama Doctrine, that multi-part series in the Atlantic magazine, if you haven't read it, read it, because it's a guide to what is happening under President Trump, as well as what motivated President Obama. We are no longer prepared to be the global leader that we had been for 7 decades. What does that mean? It means we're moving into, consciously or not, we're moving into a kind of a balance of power world, where different countries play different roles based on their interests, their alliances, and their power. What's wrong with that, to have a balance of power world vice an American-led international order? Well, balance of powers get unbalanced. A balance of power system brought 2 world wars in the 20th century. And that was the Roosevelt and then Truman overarching mindset. This time the US will lead, and it will lead with the aim of ensuring that we never again see global conflict. And when you look back, there are only 20 years between World War I and World War II, between Versailles and 1939. For Europeans, it's that was a brief truce in one horrific world war. Lots of smaller wars, some of which we should either never have gotten into or gotten out of in a hurry, granted, Vietnam. But for those 7 decades of American ascendancy, there was not a global conflict, or even close to a global conflict. And when I would give you the example, and I apologize if it's what I said last year, but nobody remembers what I said last year, least of all me. So I think I can probably get away with it. Refugees, which is a particular focus of mine. After World War II, our ground forces still in Europe, that was a main mission. Find out where refugee corridors were, get out there, police them up, get them somewhere warm and safe, and we'll move them on. Well, what happened in 2015, 2016, largely out of the Syria conflict, was build the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And this time, and this is under President Obama, we were completely absent. It's a Middle East problem, an African problem, a European problem. It was not an American problem. So that instead of policing up refugees, many of whom in this latest crisis were crossing the Mediterranean, about 4,500 of them drowned in 2016, we just stayed away from it. I mean, we've had the 6th Fleet there since 1945 in the Med, and it knows every rock, reef, current, tide, and certainly every shipping route. Common law of the sea holds that when a vessel spots another vessel in distress, it is obligated to render assistance unless that effort would endanger the vessel itself. So how many times did 6th Fleet vessels save refugees on an overloaded and foundering craft? 0, because they knew where they were. They just stayed over the horizon. If you don't see them, you're not obligated to help them, even if you know they're there. So that, to me, was the beginning of a dramatic retrenchment for the United States as a regional and global actor. Now, Trump put it on steroids. There's no question. But what worries me is that we really are now launched into the uncertainty of a new world disorder. It's not that the Chinese are going to take our place. The Chinese can't take our place. No one can. We are still the greatest power on earth without question. But again, we have chosen under 2 presidents now not to exercise that power to its fullest extent in defense of a world order that we created and that we led, not that we ever sought to dominate.
Thank you very much. Jenny?
I have a question, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little because I'm just not quite sure. Are there countries that would have an interest in instability in the Middle East?
Yeah, that is a great question. There are forces of order. Are there also forces of disorder? Certainly, the answer to that is yes. That's the general thrust of Iran's regional policies, to create disorder, to keep adversaries or rivals off balance. In the case of Iraq, and this I believe was an absolute hallmark of Qasem Soleimani. He had the Iraq portfolio for the Iranian government, and he was a veteran of all 8 years of the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. Commissioned as an infantry second lieutenant in the summer of 1980, just a month or so before the war broke out with Saddam's attack on Iran. And for 7 of those 8 years, he was, again, literally in the trenches as an infantry officer. At one point, he had not yet reached the age of 30, and he was an acting division commander because everybody above him had been killed. So when Soleimani thought of Iraq, he didn't think in terms of a natural ally with a Shia majority. He didn't think in terms of an Iraq that would be totally controlled by Iran. He knew the differences were such, including the legacy of the war, that those would not be achievable. So the policy he pursued was to keep Iraq off balance, to ensure that Iran could create enough disorder and chaos that no government in Iraq would ever be able to even conceive of attacking Iran again. I mean, that was an existential moment for Iran. Saddam calculated that they were in such a mess after the revolution that they would not be able to resist his offensive. He was wrong. But clearly no Iranian ever wanted to suffer that again, least of all Qasem Soleimani. So the whole Iranian strategy there was to just keep Iraq beholden to Iran and in a state of enough confusion and disunity that it would never constitute a threat again to Iran. It was kind of like Syria and Lebanon, kind of the same thing. Just keep it boiling. So, and then you see that it's the same hallmark of, it's what Iran is doing in Yemen, same thing. Much less strategic significance for Iran than Iraq, but still you can see the same tactic, using the Houthis just to keep it boiling, suck in the Saudis, suck in the Emiratis. The Emiratis got out, the Saudis are still sucked in. So as a force of disorder in the region, that would be Iran in all caps. Now, that is also, I think, a hallmark of Russia's strategy. They have been a strong actor in creating as much disunity in Europe as they can. The more disunified Western, formerly known as Western Europe, is, better for Russia, which is why they just loved the Obama administration refugee policy. That forcing Syrian refugees, well, first attacking civilian population centers in Syria, Aleppo being the worst, that was done to weaponize refugees, that they'll flee for their lives and they'll flee west. I think it worked out better than Putin could have dreamed. The refugee problem, in the absence of US leadership, brought Europe to its greatest level of disunity since World War II. And that is exactly what the Russians want. They do not want a unified Europe. That's a danger, and it makes it difficult for them to maneuver. So disunity and disorder in Europe, that's what they want, and that's what they got. And it's not going away anytime soon. So regionally, it's Iran. Globally, it's Russia. And again, a very good question.
Thank you.
Ambassador, I have a question about Saudi Arabia. I'm an Air Force veteran. I've been to Saudi Arabia about 8 times after Desert Storm. I always thought of it as a country with a thin veneer of modern life on an ancient culture. And then MBS came in a number of years ago with the stated goal of modernizing the economy, modernizing the culture, granting certain rights to women. So he had, and even with Saudi Aramco, starting a hedge fund with that. How much do you think the Khashoggi murder sidetracked that?
Well, again, it's a great question. And it allows me to start with one of my little homilies, which is, as Americans, we got to be careful about thinking we know more of other people's complex cultures than we actually do. Saudi Arabia being a case in point, we don't know what goes on behind the veil there. The royal family has always been very secretive. we don't really know how it works. You get a little bit of insight when something unusual happens, like the ascendancy of Mohammed bin Salman. But even then, we don't know a great deal more than we do. And we have to be extremely cautious and careful in initiatives that may be taken on false assumptions. Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two most complex cultures in the Middle East by any measure. And Saudi Arabia may be even more opaque than Iran. There's enough democracy, if you will, in Iran that hard to keep really big secrets for too long. Hints get out. Not the case in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there I think we really don't know. We do know, of course, that Mohammed bin Salman has a very different view than any Saudi leader before him. And it's still an open question what the consequences of his shifts inside the kingdom are going to be. Whether at some point the rest of the family just says, we're not taking any more of this, and there is a move to remove him. Or whether over time he will prevail in significantly shifting Saudi culture. Now, in terms of the Khashoggi murder, and again, noting with due humility, I don't know how they make decisions in the kingdom. I don't think that really affected anybody too much in the kingdom. Wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. If it's noteworthy, it would be noteworthy for its clumsiness. If you're going to do a hit operation, you don't hire a carload of clowns, which is basically how that played out. All of that said, internally, I'd be quite surprised if it had much of an effect on what he was doing there. I find it unlikely that a prince of any power at all would take that up as a cudgel to use against him. And I don't want to sound like I'm accusing an entire society of human callousness in Saudi Arabia, but I just don't think these are the galvanizing events that would seriously deter or otherwise constrain the perpetrator, who is Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, we couldn't keep up a sustained international view particularly after President Trump made it clear he was just going to sweep this one under the rug.
Very much so.
Kind of the world lost interest.
Okay. I have a couple of questions related to climate change. How important is climate change, specifically the questionable future of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as drivers of conflict in the Middle East? And then a second question on climate change about the number of refugees that will be trying to escape the temperature rises and the water level rises.
Yeah, it's a great question. The Middle East, of course, is an area that has always had a shortage of water. Our first effort, post-World War II effort, diplomatically in the Middle East was all about water. Something called the Johnston Plan that we laid out about 1953, an effort to bring Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Syria into negotiations on a fair and enforceable program of water sharing. It went nowhere, but it again indicative of the strategic significance of water resources in that region. And as one looks at specific cases, Iraq and the Tigris and Euphrates, a huge issue, particularly for Iraq, which is the downstream country in that the three countries where the rivers rise and flow through, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And well before our invasion in 2003, there was a lot of Syrian and Iraqi consternation about Turkish actions to limit the flows of both rivers and pollution. It was, when I was ambassador in Syria in the late 1990s, a major issue for them vis-a-vis Turkey, and as it was for Iraq, to the extent that there would every now and then be a Saddam statement about maybe it's time to go blow up a dam in Turkey. So not a new problem and not getting any better. I had occasion to visit the marshes of Iraq, southern Iraq, in 2008, late 2008, when I was ambassador. I'd been to those same marshes in 1978, 79, on my first assignment to Iraq. Then it was a wonderland. It was just the most amazing place. These kind of reed islands out there with families living on them, and no roads or trails. It was all by boat. And then to go back all those years later, 30 years later, and see what had happened by Saddam's efforts to drain those marshes, because they were sanctuaries for insurgents, and did a very effective job of wiping out a unique aquatic culture. And what we're seeing, of course, are reduced flows in both of those major rivers, and that's not dissimilar to what we see elsewhere in the region. Yemen is almost out of water. It's, again, it's kind of hard to see under the smoke and dust of the ongoing conflict there, but before that fight started, it was approaching a point of catastrophe. And then the other dangers, I think the question indicates, is for low-lying countries, what happens as the ocean continues to rise? I don't, in my mind at least, there's no question about the fact that we have got a global warming crisis on our hands. The problem is it's hard to mobilize. And even under it, here it doesn't matter whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. We're not exactly behaving on an individual level as though we were in a climactic war. You can recycle if you want. If you don't want, that's okay too. Nobody's going to give you a citation. Those little triangles on the bottoms of plastic, 1 through 7 or whatever they are. Saw a very disturbing piece in the New York Times saying they don't mean anything. That we are recycling a tiny fraction of what we seem to think we're recycling. Plastic bags, which can't be recycled. Well, I mean, have you seen any jurisdiction move to make these things illegal? Just to take them away? No. So it's kind of hard to, if we've got a global threat, we don't seem to be acting like it. And again, if we don't act like it, probably not much of the rest of the world is going to act like it, at least at a level that brings any really dramatic change in the complacency that whatever we say, I think at heart, almost all of us are pretty complacent about this.
Ambassador, I have a question about the current state of ISIS and what was the impact of our being able to target al-Baghdadi to ISIS, excuse me.
Yeah, again, a great question. It is also an opaque organization. What I know from my own experience, though, is it's still out there. They've gone to ground. They're good at that. They had to go to ground when I was in Iraq. Before they changed the name, it was in Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, Baghdadi running it. when we are at the height of the surge, we could not eliminate the ISIS or the Al Qaeda present completely, because for folks in Sunni Muslim cities like Mosul, Al Qaeda was bad, but it wasn't as bad in their eyes as that Shia dominated government in Baghdad. Well, with all of this uncertainty, there are even more crevices where they can hide. And I'm quite confident that's what they're doing. Again, they take a long view, a lot of strategic patience. They'll hunker down and wait for the next opportunity to regroup. Now, it's going to be harder, I think, for them this time, because they had that kind of that cloak of invincibility about them early on, where they were evoking the early years of Islam, when leaders coming out of the Arabian Peninsula swept all the way across North Africa in a matter of months into Spain, that they were doing the same thing. And then they got beaten back and forced underground. So their appeal is going to be somewhat lessened when they come out again. I guess that would be good news. But the bad news is they're there and they will come out again. Now, eliminating Baghdadi, this would be another case in which I'm careful not to pretend I know more than I do. But what we saw on several occasions is Baghdadi sort of came and went. There was a period, probably about 2010, 2011, when he was not running the shows, as far as we can tell. Someone else had kind of moved into that. That person was killed, and Baghdadi, reasserted himself. So does that literally behead the movement? No. Is it important? Yes. Just as the killing of Osama bin Laden was important. After his death, and as we went through the stuff that was taken from his house, it verified what I think we already knew. He had no operational control over Al Qaeda, because if he had, we would have found him long before we did. So nothing was going in, nothing was going out, but still as a symbol, that was very important. Symbols count. So the elimination of Baghdadi counts. Another blow to that narrative of omnipotence that Islamic State was trying to further. So does that mean we can forget about them? Oh, not for a second. But they're going to have a lot of trouble, I think, trying to replicate what they were able to pull off in 2013, 2014.
Thank you.
Okay. In view of the lack of depth of reporting and the lack of world news, is there potential for a kind of a BBC for America, a stronger publicly funded news gathering and publishing effort? Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, sadly, it's gone the other way. As you noted when you introduced me, I was a member of the Broadcasting Board of Governors for almost 7 years. The board oversaw or oversees Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, all of these outlets, which we worked during our tenure there very, very hard to upgrade. We brought in the first CEO, John Lansing, who now is the CEO of National Public Radio. And he in turn brought in entity heads that were the finest in American journalism. Amanda Bennett was running Voice of America, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, the savior of the Philadelphia Inquirer, among other things. In our neck of the woods, worked in Portland for quite a while. They just don't get any better. Jamie Fly running Radio Free Europe, same thing. Alberto Fernandez, a former Foreign Service colleague, had Middle East Broadcasting Network. His Arabic is so good, he could go on Al Jazeera in Arabic and outthink and outtalk adversaries, and when he had to, outshout them too. In June, the Senate confirmed a new CEO nominated by President Trump, and in one stroke of the pen, he swept all that away. And there is an effort underway, basically, to turn that whole network into a propaganda platform for the administration, and that's just going to be deadly to our ability to broadcast what others out there see as the truth. Voice of America got started in the dark days of World War II, February 1942. A fluent German speaker named William Hale, I think, made the first broadcast in German, and the idea was to counter Nazi propaganda. And what he said in that first broadcast is, every day at this time, we will speak to you about the war. On some days, the war may be going well for us. On other days, it may be going badly, but we will tell you the truth. And that was the mantra, really, for the whole network for decades. And that's now being dismantled, and it's sad to see. I'm actually involved in a lawsuit against the administration there is one small beachhead that we've hung on to. It's called the Open Technology Fund, and it's technical in nature. It's to develop and push out the technologies that will overcome efforts by totalitarian governments to block our signals. We've been able to keep that clear, and we're fighting it out now in federal courts to try to prevent the takeover of that last little bastion, because again, that's always been the motto: we'll tell you the truth. And now we've had this very hostile takeover where the truth, shall we say, is in extreme jeopardy.
I think we have time for two more questions. Mark, you want to take one?
Well, we're 8:28. I just have one question, and maybe this could be a summation for you, but what is America's real interest in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the Middle East was a critical part of Roosevelt's post-war global strategy. In, again, February 1945, just 2 months before he died, Roosevelt flew all the way out to Egypt to meet with Ibn Saud, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, on the deck of a United States destroyer just south of the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. And it's a striking photograph. The USS Quincy was the vessel, and there's this photo of the two leaders on this relatively small rear deck of the destroyer, with a kind of surrounded by these American sailors saying, "What on earth are we looking at?" Well, what they were looking at, again, a founding pillar of our Middle East policy, oil for security. The Saudis would provide the oil. The big discoveries, and Mark, I know you know this from your time deployed out there, the big oil discoveries were made before the war started in the late 30s. So we knew it was there, and the war certainly showed us how absolutely vital petroleum products were for absolutely everything. So, and then the symbolism of the destroyer as the meeting place, making it very clear that's what this was all about. Now, that is no longer the case, at least for us. We're actually a net exporter of oil at the present time. We do not rely in any way on Middle East oil supplies, but our allies do, both in Europe and in Asia. Japan and South Korea completely dependent on Middle Eastern oil. our attitude has been, so what? You know, that's your problem, it's not ours. So the answer to the question depends, I think, on your global view. If you don't think we should be a global leader anymore, then the Middle East doesn't count for very much. Probably have to be sure that something really awful doesn't take hold of an entire country like Islamic State or Al Qaeda, but beyond that, who cares? That's, I think, a growing feeling now in the Obama administration, certainly in the Trump administration. I greatly fear the consequences of that. That the world could quickly become an unpredictable and maybe uncontrollable set of competing interests and ideologies. So again, I think it's all predicated on how you see the world and our role in it. If we're no longer going to lead elsewhere, then why lead in the Middle East? But boy, fasten your seatbelts if that's where you're going to go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask one final question because I think it's fairly quick and we need something upbeat. And that is, what is your advice for young adults in the US and other major powers?
Oh, well, this again, I came away from that West Point visit just so heartened by what I saw in terms of the cadets, you know, smart, engaged, optimistic, and extremely capable. I don't know if anybody saw the video of the review. It was the whole brigade of cadets on review, 4,400 troopers, or troopers to be, under the command of a first captain that is appointed by the academy. And that young woman was with me almost all morning in different classes and seminars, and was there at a lunch. And she looked at her watch and said, oh, I'm going to have to leave now. I got a few things to get in order for the review. Well, she was commanding, you know, 4,400 cadets out there. The superintendent of the other commissioned officers don't do this. She and her subcommanders do it. And, you know, it's effortless. It's no big deal. We'll just get out there and do that thing. So I'm coming away thinking America, it's not making America great again. It's always been great. The only times it might not be great is if we think it's not great. But you got a generation coming up that are going to guarantee that we're going to be just fine. We just have to go through some rocky years until they take over. But what I would say to young people anywhere, you know, go to hard places, do hard things. You know, the value of life is not measured in trips to the mall. Move to the sound of the guns, and that can be literal, as these young cadets will do, or it can be figurative. Where are the crises in our nation? We got a lot of them. Move to those crises, make a difference. Again, a lot of stuff out there. Just be aware of them and take advantage of it. I think here in Spokane, you know, I was born here, didn't get to spend a lot of time here. My dad was in the Air Force, but you know, it's always been home. I voted in every election since I came of age, and always voted absentee here. You know, we've got terrific institutions and you know, great kids in them. Our community college system in Spokane is one of the best in the country. But we still are in flyover country, and I think a lot of our kids and their counselors aren't aware of opportunities like the Foreign Service. That you know, figure out the range of things that interest you as a young person, research them, and pursue them. And multiple options. Make as many things as many balls as you can get in the air as you possibly can. But just make a difference. You don't want to be late in life looking back thinking shoulda, coulda, but didn't. You know, step out, step up. just make a difference.
Thank you. Beautiful
Excellent.
words. I want to tell you that the PEG members want to express our gratitude to your Ambassador Crocker for your service and for this very important discussion. And thank you to the audience for your participation. We hope you enjoyed this evening's PEG event and that you will join us again soon. We're in the process of confirming our November program, and as soon as we do, we'll get the word out to you. A video of tonight's event will be posted on our website, pegnow.org, within a couple of weeks. And to put a focus on the discussion about communication, truth, in-depth reporting, I'm going to invoke Edward R. Murrow and say good night and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.